Okay, so this isn't exactly a roast of my code. The feedback I'll be going over today was actually very kind and polite, but I know that my code is one big ugly ball of spaghetti right now, so it deserves to be roasted. Anyway, welcome to Endeavor Games. This is a channel where I'm sharing my learn to code journey, starting out as a complete beginner. Just over 2 months ago, I had never written a line of code in my life, and then I decided to give it a go. I'm trying to be as transparent as possible and show exactly what stage I'm at every stage of the journey. Today is an exciting episode, but it's also quite technical and a bit on the long side. I was lucky enough to receive notes on my scripts from a AAA developer, and this episode is me going through that feedback and explaining what I've learned from it. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, stick around. But if not, I don't want to waste your time, so maybe leave me a sub or a thumbs up before you go, but I mean, that can't hurt. But then run away and come back next week for a shorter, more project update style video.
I'm pretty tired. Think I'll go home now.
But if you are a C# beginner like me though, this could be a really valuable video for you, and hopefully you can learn from some of my mistakes. Okay, the feedback I'm going to go through now was given to me by classic Anto. He's a UI developer for a AAA studio, but he's also making an indie pirate game in his spare time, like me. But he's obviously much more experienced as he does game dev full-time. I've thrown a link to Antonio's channel in the description of this video. He makes videos in Italian but has English subtitles, and I've picked up lots of useful tips from him, so make sure you go and check that out. So Anto very generously offered to take a look at my scripts and provide feedback. So let's jump into that now and take a look. So what I'm going to do today is take you through some of that feedback so that you can look at some of the mistakes that I've made and learn from them as well. So as you can see, my game is completely unplayable right now. So we're going to just go through these one by one, read through this feedback and talk about what it means and what I'm doing wrong. So this first script that we're looking at is called Pirate 1. Now this script is the main script that I've attached to my enemy character. One of the big pieces of feedback that I'm getting is I'm putting way too much in each class. So basically I've just got so much logic within each class, and I should be separating them out into different scripts. So you'll see if we just quickly scroll through this Pirate 1 script, just how long and crazy and how much logic is stuffed into this one script, which obviously when you look at it like that, you can see how it will very quickly become quite unmanageable and hard to keep up with. Like, this is just variables and look how many there are. It's just kind of ridiculous. So let's go through this feedback. Basically he's saying that there are too many responsibilities in this class. But the good thing is that I have separated everything out into sections. So in theory, I could take all these sections out that I've created already and put them into their own separate classes. So let's have a look at some of those sections. So for instance, we've got movement and direction here. So essentially these should be their own class, like movement and direction. So this is where I've been calculating the direction of the player and moving the pirate towards the player. And this is all being done in update as well. And another thing that I've been learning from this feedback is that essentially this could all be their own custom functions rather than doing all this heaps of logic within update. And then you just call it from update if that's the frequency that you want to call it at. So if you want to call it every frame, you just call that custom function within update. So yeah, you can see there's a heap of logic within my update function. So that was the first piece of advice, to go away and break it all up. All right, so essentially what Anto is trying to teach me here is that I should essentially be creating modular classes so that I could just throw a health component onto whatever character I want to throw it onto, and it will work for that character. Within this one script, I've been calculating the health, I've been calculating death, I've been calculating the movement, the attacks, I've been calling the attacks from here, so if in range attack. So there's just so much going on within this one. I'm sharing the detection of the player, so when I'm detecting the player, I'm sending out raycasts and telling other pirates that the player is nearby. So there's just so much going on within this one script, and I really need to split it all out into separate scripts. The next piece of advice that I was getting was I am initializing all these variables in the start function. Really, it would be a lot better to be initializing anything that is attached to the object can be initialized on awake. So I should be using awake there instead. This update function has the same issue of the entire class. There's just too much logic in one place. If you don't have different classes, it would be good to at least use different functions so you know what each function is responsible for and what it does. So that's where, instead of having a whole lot of stuff going on within update, I should be creating custom functions for check def or move character, check distance, attack, so that I don't just have to look based on these headings, keeping on scrolling through the entire function to understand what each bit of code is doing. And here you can see he's pointed out that I've got an if stun state, which I've thrown in there. It's not doing anything. There's nothing happening if you're stunned at the moment. And yeah, that was because I was keeping it for future, but it is better to remove it until then, just to keep it clean. Look at this, it's ridiculous. So let's move over to my player controller. It's called Max Controller because that's the name of my character. That was a bad call, by the way, because of the whole minimum maximum confusion. Anyway, Anto has said this class has the same problem. There are just too many things going on. But it's also the perfect example to explain why having everything in the same class is bad. So this is an example of what not to do, everyone. So basically the main difference between Max Controller and Pirate 1 is that one is controlled by the player and the other is controlled by the AI. So to achieve this, I've copied and pasted a whole lot of code that is exactly the same. For example, movement. So if I have to change something, I have to remember to change that same code in both classes to make sure that it all matches up. If I forgot to change that code, then it might cause undesirable behavior and it would be very hard to debug. So by creating separate scripts and separate classes with a specific responsibility, for instance, I could have a player input controller and an AI input controller, and then add different components to both of them, so separate classes for movement, for attacks, for animation, etc. That way it's modular. I could be adding the same movement script onto my player as I add it to the enemy, but with separate input scripts. So that means I'm not doubling up on writing movement scripts for both. Same goes for attack and animation, all that sort of thing. So basically it's trying to create a more modular system so that if movement is essentially the same for separate characters, I can use that same movement script and just use a separate input script. So for example, in Anto's game, his own pirate game that he's working on, he has a generic class character, and that is just an empty container for all of the other components. So then he has a health component, a movement component, an attack component. So he can create different characters with different components and kind of build them up in that way. So on the character controlled by the player, I can simply add the player input controller, and that's enough to control it without changing any of the other components. On players controlled by the AI, he is able to just add his AI input controller, and that's it. Then if I want to show the health of the player, I can simply add the UI health component onto the character controlled by the player, and the UI health component will listen to the health component of the character without actually caring if it's controlled by the player or the AI. So basically it's creating all these self-sufficient classes, whereas my current scripts, they basically have a lot of dependencies. So this means that I could add a UI component onto a character also controlled by the AI. It would show his health on screen. So let's scroll down here. So again, this is another script that is just absolutely huge and very hard to navigate. Down here in update, we have a function. Well, it's not its own function. We're doing something in update to calculate game over. So basically we're calculating when health goes below 0. We are restarting the scene, and we're debugging a game over message at the moment. This should definitely be another class that is listening to those game over conditions. I've been using a lot of strings within my code, and strings are very slow. They can slow down your code, especially when using in fixed update or update. This drink rum animation is never going to change, so you can actually set that as a static class variable, so that it doesn't need to keep searching that string every frame, for instance, which is really going to slow down even a 2D game. We're just running these functions all the time, which is very intensive. Okay, let's move on to the camera controller. This didn't have as many issues with it. Obviously, it is a much simpler script, and it's also one that I built based on tutorials from much more experienced developers. So the script is not nearly so bad. So Anto has pointed out that this is just a code style note, that it's usually better to have all variables with a specific access modifier, so all private variables grouped together and all public variables grouped together. Because here you can see I've got a public variable, then a private variable, then a public variable. That's not the best way of doing it. It would be better to group them based on their access. So that's an easy fix really for this script. Now below, Unity automatically creates methods like start, but as you can see, I'm doing nothing in the start function. So Anto's basically, he's just telling me that it's better to just get rid of unused methods and variables. So that's an easy fix again. So moving over into my spawn manager, which is my most recent script that I wrote last week, Anto has pointed out that in general, a class called spawn manager shouldn't have audio and UI elements. Because at the moment, within the spawn manager, I am triggering things like the spawn sound effects and spawn UI display. So again, that's just another point of splitting out these classes and separating them and having a separate UI class and a sound class and have them talk to each other rather than doing all these things within the spawn manager script. So here I have created an array of game objects called getPirateCount. Anto has pointed out that it's not best practice using get in the name of an array because get is usually reserved for functions, because functions will be actually getting something. So a more clear and less confusing name for this array would be remaining enemies or alive enemies, because that is essentially what it is. This array is the amount of remaining enemies. So that's just sort of a point on making this code less confusing. So down here, basically Anto said I should not be spawning rum in a function that is called spawn enemy wave. And that is basically because it's very confusing and it's not clear that that's what's going on. So either it could be spawn wave, and within wave you have several things that happen in that spawn wave, or I have a separate spawn rum function. So down here in update, Anto is explained to me that using the find objects with tag, that is a very slow function, and it should never be used in update, which is called every frame, because basically it's doing a costly function every single frame, so it's going to slow your game right down, and I think I have been noticing that. So if you just need the count to check when all enemies are dead, it's better to just keep an integer count somewhere and just decrease it every time you kill an enemy down to 0, and obviously increase it if you are adding enemies in. Also in general, rather than instantiating enemies every time, that's a slow operation, so I could disable those dead enemies and enable them back when I need them again. So I'm only instantiating the difference, like the additional ones that are needed, rather than destroying and instantiating and destroying and instantiating again. You're only instantiating once and then disabling and enabling. This is called object pooling. That's a new term to me. It's all new to me, to be honest. And it's very useful with objects that you create and destroy continuously, for example, bullets. That is something I'm going to have to look a lot more into, because right now it's kind of hurting my brain. So Anto has been pointing out that my public variables should all come first in a block and then private variables after that. That's just best practice. But in this case, most of my public variables don't actually need to be public and could be using serialized field. So they will show up and you can assign them within the inspector, but they can't be modified by other classes. So that's just a better way of doing this, rather than having all these public variables, which can get dangerous and messy. And the only reason I'm making them public is so that I can see them in the inspector anyway. In some cases, I'm assigning, for instance, a camera. So that could be a serialized field rather than a public game object. All right, we're going to move on from that script. Now we're at the pirate primary attack. Okay, so if we go down here into fixed updates, Anto has pointed out that it's better to avoid hard coding values in their functions. It's better to have them as class variables. And what I think he's meaning by this is this should be its own custom function, but when attack push is running, I've been setting things like the distance variable. So that could be a class variable so that we can always change that. So max distance, minimum distance, etc. All right, down here in primary cooldown, again, the same thing. It's better to avoid hard coding values within the functions, better to have them as class variables. So here you can see I've got how long I'm waiting for seconds within this primary cooldown. That could be a class variable. It could even be fed in through here, so it could have float cool time, for instance, and then that could be cool time. So I should be doing things more like that, so that this is a variable rather than a hard-coded value. Right, we're going to jump over into the health bar. As you can see, this one is fine, and that is because I copied this one from a tutorial. As Anto said, all classes should be like this one: small, one responsibility, few methods, and few variables. So anyway, my goal from now on will be to try and write nice and short scripts that look like this one and do just one thing. Yeah, I hope that this has been interesting looking through this and hearing what the feedback has been on these scripts so far. As you can see, I've got a lot of work to do to untangle this giant ball of spaghetti. But yeah, that's going to be my mission from this point on for the next week, to write some better scripts, and then we can check in later and I'll show them to you. Thanks everybody for making it to the end of this lengthy video. I hope you picked up a few new ideas and learned something like I did. Thanks once again to Classic Anto. You are a legend. Your feedback was so generous, and just a wee reminder for everyone, there's a link to his channel down below. If you haven't already, please throw me a like and whack that subscribe button. It really helps the channel. And yeah, until next week, have a good one. Write some spaghetti code, just not too spaghetti. Bye for now.